Hi friends, Mr. Sherman again. Today we're going to talk about two topics that are either in the news or are going to be in the news in the very near future. One is the United Nations. Now we talked a little bit about that in our Zoom meeting, and the other one is the Korean War. First off, you guys know that the United Nations was created after World War II in order to try to use diplomacy to maybe fend off potential real big large-scale world conflicts. But what you may not know is how it's set up. First off, the United Nations is made up of member nations that create something called the General Assembly. That's all the member nations, and they can send a representative. But the most important part of this is there's something called the UN Security Council. I'm telling you about this for a reason. The UN Security Council was made up of the five major powers that won World War II. The United States, France, Great Britain, the USSR, and China. Now, one of the things that you might be thinking is, wait a minute. There's three good guys there, the US, France, and Great Britain, and there's two commies there. Well, they were both allies, and only one of them was communist at the time, the Soviet Union. But this is going to lead to a real live problem because members of the UN Security Council, those five nations initially, had the ability to veto anything that happened in the UN. A veto basically means no. So if something goes all the way through and every single vote in the General Assembly is yay, and China says no, it doesn't happen. And that has happened frequently, particularly during the Cold War, when China and the Soviet Union really didn't want to do anything that we wanted to do, and we didn't want to do anything that they wanted to do. So we frequently used our veto powers. But I also want to tell you a little bit about some of the cool things that the United Nations can do. We'll talk a little bit about what they're good and what they're not so good at. First off, UNESCO, or the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organizations. UNESCO, it pushes for peace through education and science. The United Nations is a huge advocate of educating the world and making sure that children have education, everything, but a huge push towards science. The United States was a massive advocate for this because we figured if you're highly educated, you're never going to become a communist. It's just silly. You'll go out and you'll get a really good job, all right? The next thing is the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund. What its role was, to varying degrees of success, was to try to create financial stability overall. Also, to really work toward a global trade economy. Now, it's very good at creating the global trade economy, just so you know. Another really cool organization that I grew up learning about, because you used to, during Halloween, you used to carry a little UNICEF carton and people would pay money and it helped kids. But UNICEF was aid to hungry children. And it's still around. You don't hear about it a lot, but right now UNICEF is pushing to make sure that young people in particular are taken care of during the coronavirus outbreak. It's really interesting. They are really, right now, as we speak, looking very carefully into Africa to try to set up a health system in parts of Africa that don't have effective health systems, knowing that the coronavirus could explode there. Let's hope it doesn't. Also, UNICEF is huge when it comes to finding food for kids and vaccinating the world's children. The United Nations very effectively vaccinates the world and stops really nasty diseases. And so that's one of the things the United Nations is best at, eliminating horrific diseases. That's a good thing. Another thing that the United Nations has is the World Health Organization, talking about diseases. Basically, the WHO makes health a priority around the world. They are extremely good at controlling diseases, like when Ebola strikes and things like that. The World Health Organization is really, really, really effective at letting us know what's going on, what isn't going on, things like that, when the member states of the UN Security Council are on board. That's a big issue. If a member of the UN Security Council backs away, it really is harder for the whole thing to work. And so, like, let's say China doesn't want the World Health Organization to be involved in the coronavirus. It's hard for the WHO to get into China to see what was going on. The United Nations is really, really good at controlling diseases. Really. They're also super good at things like organizing aviation so that planes don't crash into each other. And it's the same thing with ships at sea. And they are super good at weather. The United Nations has a heck of a lot of weather stations, weather satellites, buoys in the oceans to tell us what the heck is going on. And so the United Nations gives the world an idea of what's happening with the weather. And so that's extremely helpful. The UN employs thousands upon thousands of scientists and doctors and technicians, just lots and lots of people. What the United Nations has proven to not be particularly good at is really peacekeeping. It struggles with peacekeeping. It's not meant to be a military force. Like the United Nations has military arms that are donated by member states, but the United Nations itself is not an army and isn't supposed to be an army, so they're not particularly good at that. Let me tell you a little bit of an issue that you should know about tying the United Nations into the Korean War, and that's what we're going to talk about next. Ladies and gentlemen, the Korean War lasted from June of 1950 until July of 1953. There is a tie-in to the United Nations. We'll get there. Let me give you a little idea about some of the background. The reason we're talking about Korea is that it's going to be in the news very soon. I just know it. It's going to happen. Here's the deal. Korea was a former Japanese territory, and just before really World War II. And what's going to happen is, as a result of World War II, the Korean Peninsula is going to be freed, kind of, because what happens is the United States basically takes South Korea as a protectorate, and North Korea becomes communist, influenced by eventually the Chinese and Russia, because China is going to become communist. What's going to happen is U.S. forces are going to be in South Korea, but most of our forces were actually in Japan doing end-of-war occupation duties. And we still have soldiers all over the world today, even in our areas of our former enemies who are now our allies, like Germany and Japan. Well, what's going to happen is in 1950, 75,000 North Korean troops are going to swoop down the Korean peninsula and attack South Korea. The reason they did that is they had been listening to America, and we talked about a sphere of influence, but areas that we control and think are super important, and we just failed to mention Korea. So the North Koreans went, hey, if we invade South Korea, we can unify all of Korea under communism. And that's what they're going to attempt to do. Caught us completely by surprise. The troops that we were able to throw into the field were pushed back all the way to the southern port of Busan. What's going to happen is the United Nations is going to be called to respond. Now, what you know about the United Nations is that Russia, there's no way they're going to say, yeah, sure, kill our allies. That sounds like a great idea. And there's no way China's going to do that. But here's the deal. China had recently switched. Mao Zedong was a communist. He took over all of mainland China. We refused to seat their representative in the United Nations. So he wasn't there. Russia, because we did that, said, then I'm not going to be there either. And they grabbed their marbles and they left the playground. So what's going to happen is China and Russia weren't there. And so we asked the United Nations, can you help us? And the United Nations gave the go-ahead for United Nations troops, almost all of them were Americans, but there were others. We were given the okay to invade Korea. And what happened was General MacArthur is going to do a pretty impressive naval landing at the city of Incheon, which was kind of behind where the North Koreans were currently. And what had to happen was the North Koreans had to basically turn back around and they rushed north to go back to their own territory, and we followed them. In fact, we followed them so quickly, it was a little scary. We were outstripping our supply lines, but we had air superiority, and we were pummeling the North Koreans. We got all the way toward the Yalu River, which is the border of China, when Mao Zedong said, whoa, 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 hold up. Our President Truman said to General MacArthur, hey, are the Chinese going to attack? And MacArthur said, no, I know the Chinese, they're not going to attack. What's going to happen? Apparently about 1 million Chinese crossed the border and hit our soldiers. We were woefully outnumbered. And what's going to happen is something called a strategic withdrawal. It was organized. It was not a rout. It was a retreat. But we weren't running away in a disorganized fashion. It was a fighting withdrawal. We moved back all the way to the 38th parallel. And what's going to happen is a stalemate at that point. Both sides stopped. We began peace negotiations that dragged on for, well, until the end of the war. And what's going to happen is the reason this all occurred is that Truman feared a war in Europe. Just so you know, Korea is not in Europe. But the fear was the Chinese, allied with the North Koreans, allied with the Soviet Union, might use this as a pretext to attack Europe as a whole. We didn't want that. So we didn't want to go overboard, i.e. we didn't want to use nuclear missiles or specifically attack China. So we had rules of engagement, and it was even difficult to fly into Chinese airspace and stuff like that. So it's fighting with a hand tied behind your back, a little bit blindfolded. But we didn't want a World War III. So what's going to happen eventually, a new president is going to take charge, a gentleman named Eisenhower. Eisenhower was the Supreme Allied Commander of all forces during all forces in Europe during World War II, the good guys, and he said, I want to visit Korea. That is my #1 goal. And people went, you know what, this guy has military experience, he looks like my really cool grandpa, and we think he can fix things. And he fulfilled his campaign promise. He did go to Korea. And what eventually is going to happen, there's going to be a truce at the 38th parallel. Basically a ceasefire. We know that 10% of all of the population of Korea was killed during this war. It was unbelievable. We lost 40,000 Americans. Which is right now about 20,000 fewer Americans than have died due to the coronavirus, just as a little, get an idea of numbers type of thing. But eventually, it's like, this is how it is. North Korea is communist, and South Korea is not. And South Korea became extremely successful economically, and North Korea is really a failed state. It just is. Here's the deal. Kim Jong-un might not be doing particularly well. There's some interesting rumors about him. He still periodically fires missiles. No American president would ever talk to a North Korean dictator. You don't talk to dictators, really. That's always been American policy because it grants them power. Our current president did meet with Kim Jong-un, and they exchanged letters. And our current president's idea was that maybe he could make a deal, maybe he could open up diplomacy. Maybe it'll work, we really don't know yet. But I will tell you that expect crazy things coming out of Korea. But to lose 40,000 American soldiers in the fight against communism is a huge deal. All right? It was called the Forgotten War for a long time. It shouldn't be. Every soldier who served should be honored. Veterans should be honored, just so you know. Maybe I'm old school. But I want you guys to have a great day. I miss seeing you. And enjoy the warmer days. All right? Thank you very much. Have a good day. This is Jack. Say hi. Say hi to the people. You're my boy. Yes, you are. Some licorice. That's my boy.